Good evening, everyone. My name is Adam Pratt, and I am the Public Relations Coordinator here at McPherson College, basically the PR guy here. A few first things first. Do please make sure that you've had some coffee or other refreshments just behind that pillar where I can't see it. And then this is a related issue. Bathrooms are downstairs or upstairs, one flight, kind of back toward this wall, should you need them. So on behalf of everyone here at McPherson College, I just want to welcome you to the third of 5 lectures this year in the college's annual series. And tonight, it is my distinct privilege to introduce to you Dr. Harry Turtledove. Now, the first time I ever asked Dr. Turtledove for something, just slightly more than a year ago, he turned me down. Now, to be fair, he was absolutely within his rights to do so. You see, I volunteer in my spare moments as assistant editor for a science fiction podcast out of England that's called Starship Sofa. At the time, I was contacting Dr. Turtledove to ask permission to run one of his recent stories on the podcast for free. As there was a strong possibility that the audio rights still had money-making prospects for him, he politely declined. I said I understood. Then I asked for permission to run an older story, also for free. To my delight, he agreed. And at this point, he also set me straight by asking that I just call him Harry instead of instead of Dr. Turtledove, which I've done 3 times in this intro just to drive him nuts.
It's a short drive, don't worry.
Well, after this, I then asked him for 4 more stories for free. And again, he agreed. Then at Jim Dodson's urging, my boss at the time, by the way, I asked Harry whether he would consider coming to McPherson College to lecture. And once again, he agreed to consider traveling from California and to, and I quote now, bore the people on the other side of the lectern. Later, after plans were confirmed, he mentioned in passing, somewhat distressingly, I'll talk with anyone dumb enough to want to talk to me. But let me reassure you right now, you have little chance of being bored tonight. Harry has the distinction of writing more than 100 novels, which places him among the most prolific science fiction and fantasy authors, basically of all time. It's kind of on a par with Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury in terms of number of novels. Now, you cannot deny this one. He is a Hugo Award winner for the novella Down in the Bottomlands. And for those of you who managed to escape growing up a nerd, the Hugo Award is basically the Oscars of science fiction. Science fiction literature. Mostly, though, he's known as the master of the alternate history genre. A lot of his work takes real historical events and tweaks them in one or more ways that are realistic or fantastic or a little bit of both. Some of his best-known works are the Atlantis series, which has European explorers landing on the east coast of North America, which is broken off from the continent to be situated in the mid-Atlantic. Another one is Guns of the South, in which Confederates win the Civil War after receiving AK-47s from time travelers. And the World War series, set at the beginning of World War II, when lizard-like aliens invade. I love this kind of literature. Beyond his resume, I think you'll find Harry, as I have, to be a funny, generous, intelligent, and all-around decent human being. So if you enjoy his talk, I will gladly take credit, For the bizarre alternate universe in which you don't,
I get the blame.
no, blame Jim Dodson. And so I am very pleased to turn this microphone over to Dr. Harry Turtledove.
Get my semi-legible notes out here. Thank you all for coming out on what to a Californian seems a ridiculously cold night. You laugh. I don't. I particularly want to thank McPherson College, want to thank Adam, want to thank Steve Gustafson for helping to arrange all this. They didn't know what they were getting into, but they will find out. And I would also like to thank, some of you may possibly have heard that I did an interview on KSAL this morning. I don't know if anybody heard it. If nobody heard it, then well, that's. But this is one that developed an entirely new alternate history, according to the interviewer, because it was one where Arthur Haley wrote 2001: A Space Odyssey. I'm not making this up. As I have said in other contexts, fiction has to be plausible. History just has to happen. This happened. Somewhere there is a recording of it, which probably is decomposing into its component electrons even as I squeak. All right. Anyway, the topic that they gave me to talk about was about alternate history, past, present, and future, which sort of reminds me of one of Al Stewart's better albums, but never mind. All right. Anyway, most science fiction springs from, I think, the same impulse that spawned historical fiction earlier in the 19th century. And that is the realization, which didn't exist before technology speeded up, of seeing how things changed not just between lifespans, but within a lifespan. Because through most of human history and prehistory, the way you lived was pretty much the same way your father lived, and your grandfather lived, and his grandfather lived. Early in the 19th century, people like Sir Walter Scott, noticed that technology and the changes brought on by technology were happening rapidly enough that the way they had lived when they were kids had changed a great deal by the time they grew older. And out of this realization, I think, sprang historical fiction. Because before this time, there was much less of a sense that the past was different from the present. In much of medieval art, if you see, for example, the crucifixion of Christ, in medieval art, you will usually see the Roman soldiers wearing medieval style armor, because that was the style of armor the artist was used to, and he could not imagine anyone wearing anything else. It wasn't like that by the early 19th century, and seeing that the past and the customs of the past were different made them interesting in a way that they hadn't been before, because you could use them to illustrate the difference between the past and the present, and either to say how wonderful it was in the good old days, or to say, see what a bunch of savages those people were who were our great-grandfathers? Okay, so that's how historical fiction happened. Then a couple of more generations went by, and things like steam-powered ships came along, and things like the telegraph came along, the 19th century equivalent of the internet, which it quite literally was. And people began to see that technology was changing faster than ever, and that as a result, their lives were changing faster than ever. they began to see that all kinds of interesting things had been invented, and they began to wonder what other kinds of interesting things were yet to be invented, and what kind of consequences these other, imaginary inventions would have. And that is the impulse that spawned, in the 1860s and 70s, Jules Verne, and in the 1890s, H.G. Wells, who really transplanted the SF novel to the English language. All right, so this is how most science fiction happened, not alternate history. Because alternate history is much older than any of this. Alternate history, the first example that I know of somebody deliberately writing an alternate history, or alternative history if you have that attitude toward the language, go ahead, I'll let you, was right around the time of Christ, when the Roman historian Livy wondered, in his History of Rome, what would have happened had Alexander the Great not died at the age of 33, but had lived to turn west and attack the Roman Republic in the late 4th century BC. Now, Livy's opinion, good patriotic Roman that he was that his umpty great-grandparents would have kicked Alexander's tail around the block. My opinion is that Livy was a wild-eyed optimist, but that is, neither really here nor there. Because the point is that Livy, altogether without knowing it, invented, as far as I can tell, alternate history. And Livy was so far ahead of his time that the next examples that I know of date from the 19th century again. And again, as with Jules Verne, they are French. There were several writers in the middle to later part of the 19th century who speculated on what would have happened had Napoleon been triumphant rather than defeated. And again, they thought everything would have been sugar pie and lollipops and all the wonderful things in the world. And again, I think they are wild-eyed optimists. And once again, my opinion does not matter 2 cents. All right, but the point that I am trying to make is that alternate history, unlike other forms of science fiction, does not depend on technological change. You can work technological change into it if you are so inclined. You can imagine that an invention was made earlier than it was or was not made. You can imagine time travelers, even time travelers with AK-47s if you're twisted enough. But alternate history really depends on wondering about what might have been. And we all have. Every one of us has moments that we can look back on and wonder what might have been if things had gone just a little bit differently. And I'm going to tell you about a couple of mine. One of them, which is basically the reason that I am standing here in front of you today, doing my best not to bore you too much anyway, is that when I started reading science fiction when I was, maybe 8 years old in the 3rd grade, when I found the Mushroom Planet books in my elementary school library, and the Miss Pickrell stories, which I didn't, which being in the 3rd grade, I didn't know how god-awful they were, and other stuff that they served up to children in, when I was a kid, and called it science fiction for children. When I was 11 or 12, I found Andre Norton and Robert A. Heinlein, and like any junkie, I was hooked for life very quickly. And a couple of years after that, in a secondhand bookstore near the house where I was living with my mom, I found a copy of a book called Lest Darkness Fall by L. Sprague de Camp. Some of us, I see some of you know it, and I said, but for those of you who don't know it, it is a Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court kind of story. It drops a modern archaeologist, modern then because it was written in 1939, but you know, that's close enough, back into the Italy of the 6th century AD, when Italy was ruled by the Ostrogoths, who had taken it away from the Western Roman Empire, and when the Eastern Roman Empire, otherwise known, cue the portentous music, as the Byzantine Empire, dun, 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 there, slightly late on the cue, but what can you do, was trying to reconquer it. It's a great book. I mean, this book has been in print continuously for the past 75 years. I wrote an introduction to one of the editions, and I got to tell Sprague de Camp what it did to my life. Because you see, when I read this book, I was fascinated. I had read a couple of others by de Camp and liked them, but this one particularly got to me. I started trying to trying to research what de Camp was making up and what was real in this story, because I knew very little about the period before I ran into it. And I found out that Sprague was not making up very much, and that almost everything in there was real. And I started trying to learn more and more about this stuff. Okay, I was a scientist by original intention. I started reading science fiction because it had science in it. Some of you out there are nodding. All right, this phenomenon is recognizable, I see. Okay, and I was a bright kid at a reasonably good public high school in Los Angeles, and I did pretty well when I was in high school, and got into Caltech with the intention of becoming an astronomer, and flunked out most ingloriously at the end of my freshman year because calculus was much tougher than I was. You laugh. All right, as a result of this, I spent a year at Cal State Los Angeles getting my GPA back up to the point where it was visible, A, to my naked eye, and B, since the year in question was 1967-68, where it was visible to my draft board's naked eye, a seriously relevant consideration at the time, as some of you will remember. And then I went on to UCLA, and I got a bachelor's in history, and I got a master's in history, and I was awarded a doctorate in Byzantine history with all the rights and privileges appertaining thereto, which means I got to say, do you want fries with that? Yes, this is one of those jokes that would be funny if only it were funny, if you know what I mean. All right. Now, as a result of having this PhD in Byzantine history, well, let's see. I taught for 2 years at UCLA while the fellow under whom I had studied had a guest gig in Greece. While I was teaching there, I met the lady that I'm married to now. We have 3 daughters. We have 1 granddaughter. So let's see. Let's do an alternate history. Let's suppose that some sneaky son of a gun with a time machine, bent on complicating my life, broke into that bookstore the night before I arrived and lifted that copy of Lest Darkness Fall. This was mid-60s, remember. You know, books were not easy to find. I wouldn't have run across this one, since it was then not much in print anyway, probably for another couple of years, and which means that Let's see. If I hadn't found that book then, if that nefarious time traveling whatever he was lifted it, let's see. I would not have the degree I have. I would not have written what I've written. I would not be married to the lady that I'm married to. I would not have the kids I have. I would have written something, by the way. I should note, I already had the bug by the time I found the book. I would not, I would not be living where I'm living. I wouldn't be talking about alternate history in front of you folks tonight. Other than that, it didn't change my life a bit. Okay, example number 2. All right, as I say, I mentioned, I met the lady that I'm married to while I was teaching at UCLA. I was 28. I was coming off a divorce. I had just broken up with my first wife. This was possibly not entirely unconnected to the fact that I was just starting to sell at the time. That was not the only thing that went wrong, believe me, and there was plenty of blame on both sides. So Laura and I went out once, and we got along pretty well. She was 18 and too dumb to know not to go out with 28-year-old guys who were just coming off a divorce. Innocent, perhaps I should say, perhaps. And we went out another time, and we had a good time, and I liked her. She was a nice gal, and I could see that she liked me, and I was thinking, I don't know about this. I don't know if I'm ready for this. And I said, I don't know if we ought to go out anymore, and we came, that close to, yeah, okay, that was fun, but this just isn't going to fly, because I was scared, I was scared, I didn't know if I wanted to go head over heels again. And we talked about it for a while, and we ended up going out again and seeing what happened. And that was 35 years ago. And I count myself the luckiest man in the world. And this is another moment in my life that could easily have gone the other way, and the consequences on it, I don't know how many marriages I would be working on, but I'm not sure I could count them on one hand, because there aren't a whole lot of people running around loose in this world who can put up with me for 35 minutes, let alone 35 years. Okay, we all have these moments in our lives, the fender bender that made us late for the job interview. So we went to the watering hole next door to where we would have had the job interview, except they didn't want to talk to us because we were an hour late, right? And we meet somebody there, and then, 20 years later, you wonder, how the heck did that happen? We all have moments like that. Maybe Livy was contemplating a fender bender of his own when he was setting pen to papyrus and talking about Romans and fighting Alexander's hoplite band, And this is alternate history on what you might call the micro-historical level. And if we start thinking about these moments in our own life, the jump from the micro-historical level to the macro-historical level, to changing, whole countries' fates or whole world's fates rather than just your own fate or your next door neighbor's fate because he's such a schmuck. It's an easy jump to make. Now, through, maybe 1940, alternate history pretty much stayed the province, the playground, maybe I ought to say, of intellectuals on a lark. In 1931, Winston Churchill wrote an alternate history. It's called If Lee Had Not Won at the Battle of Gettysburg. And it's in a book edited by a fellow named J.C. Squires. If It Had Happened Otherwise, Lapses into Imaginative History. That lapses in the title of the book is telling. It shows that the people who were writing for this book were playing a game. And note that Churchill was playing it at a depth deeper than any of the other contributors, because Churchill is doing the double whammy. He is writing in a universe where Lee won, imagining a universe different from our real one in which Lee had lost. 3 years later, in 1934, Arnold Toynbee, in the second part of A Study of History, wrote an essay called The Forfeited Birthright of the Abortive Western Christian Civilization, which postulates the rise of Celtic Christianity as opposed to Roman, and which postulates a successful Muslim invasion of France rather than the one that failed. Now, this brings us to the question, how did alternate history then become part of what we call science fiction? Well, for one thing, science fiction writers do a lot of it. One of the early novellas of alternate history was Sprague de Camp's, again, same guy who wrote Lest Darkness Fall, novella called The Wheels of If. And this novella was essentially written to dramatize and to answer the questions that Toynbee posed about what civilization would have looked like had the Celtic Church in the British Isles succeeded and had the Muslims conquered France as well as Spain. And a lot of science fiction writers have done an awful lot of alternate history. People like Murray Leinster, whose story called Sidewise in Time gives the name to the Sidewise Award that's given for alternate history every year. Sprague de Camp, whom I mentioned. Poul Anderson, which is a name you should know. H. Beam Piper. Philip K. Dick. Quite a few of you, whether you read a lot of SF or not, may have read or have heard of The Man in the High Castle, which is one of the really good stories about a world in which the Axis won the Second World War. John Brunner, S.M. Sterling, Kim Newman, who writes a lot of alternate history, some of it tinged with fantasy. William Sanders, whose story The Undiscovered is one of the best riffs on Shakespeare I have ever read. I've been known to perpetrate it myself. And it is really fitting that it should work this way, because the extrapolation process in alternate history works the same way as it does in regular science fiction, only it works at a different place on the timeline. Most science fiction will make a change in the present or the nearer future, and then extrapolate from that change and see what happens in the more distant future. Alternate history does exactly the same thing, except it does it on a different place in the timeline. You change something in the deeper past, and then look what that change means, or what you think it might mean, in the nearer past or in a revised present. Now, one of the things that the title of this lecture sort of imposed on me was wondering, well, what good is alternate history? What's the point of it? For one thing, of course, it keeps an underemployed Byzantine historian from selling oranges out of boxes at a freeway off-ramp in Los Angeles. So I mean, obviously this is a great and worthy purpose. But it also gives any writer who takes a shot at it a funhouse mirror that's really impossible to get any other way. Because all fiction, not just alternate history, not just science fiction, but all fiction is about the world the writer lives in, not the created world. The created worlds that writers make point at things that are there in the real world and they highlight something that the writer sees there. And with alternate history, you can look at things from a perspective that you can't get any other way. I mean, the ideal alternate history story, it's supposed to make a reader feel, and it's also supposed to make a reader think. One of the finest compliments I ever got as a writer came from a reviewer who wrote that a novel of mine made him think he was reading an accurate portrayal of a world that in fact never existed. Alternate history in this regard, if you do it this way, if you intend to create a realistic effect, it can be like a trompe-l'oeil painting. But that's all it is. It is a thought experiment. You can be plausible. Most of the time, you will want to be plausible. Not always. Sometimes you want to have fun and goof on what really happened. I mean, if there are places in alternate history where you can cheat. If you imagine a world where the American Revolution never happened, where America remained a contented part of the British Empire, as Richard Dreyfuss and I did in The Two Georges, it is very unlikely that Richard Nixon would be born in that world. But if you are writing about the late 20th century of this world, and you want to stick in a spectacularly rancid used car salesman known as Tricky Dick, you can do that. But the thing that you should do is that you should know you are cheating, and then, as has been attributed to Luther, you should sin proudly. Am I guilty of this? Yes, I've done these things. But anyway, the other part of that point is that when you are writing an alternate history, being plausible is the most you can hope for. You can't, by the nature of things, be right because you can't know whether you are or not. And this is a point that not everybody gets. There are some people with remorselessly literal minds who say, no, you did that wrong. No, perhaps I did it implausibly, but I didn't do it wrong, and there's a difference. The other difference between alternate history and other forms of science fiction and fantasy is that in other forms of science fiction and fantasy, the reader knows only as much as you are telling him. If you are inventing a future society or a fantasy world, the reader can't say, no, that's not right. The reader can just say, no, that's a bunch of bull, which is not the same thing at all. But you're not projecting onto a blank screen. If I'm writing about Abraham Lincoln in Chicago in an 1881 where the Confederate States won the Civil War, people already have ideas about who Abraham Lincoln was. They have ideas about what Chicago was like in 1881. And you sort of, when you're working with this stuff, when you're writing this stuff, you have to think about things like that because you are not projecting onto a blank screen. I'm talking about this particular example with malice aforethought because this is part of the scenario of my novel How Few Remain, which is the first of what some people call the Timeline 191 series, which is based on a world where Lee's Special Orders 191 were not lost after the Confederate courier wrapped them around 3 cigars. This is the stuff, as I said, history just has to happen. It doesn't have to be plausible. These orders and the cigars were lost. A Union sergeant and a corporal found them, opened them up, didn't toss out the paper wrapped around the cigars, which is the first unlikelihood right there, looked at the paper, saw, oh, this is interesting, and took it to their company CO. He kicked it up the chain of command until it came to one of McClellan's aides. McClellan's aide recognized the handwriting of Lee's aide who had composed the order because they had gone to West Point together. Joys of Civil War, right? And McClellan, recognizing that this was genuine and that Lee's army was stretched out all over creation and a good part of Maryland and Virginia, said, if with this I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will go home. And he did, just barely and not too skillfully, at the Battle of Antietam. And the Battle of Antietam, if you ask me, was the most important battle of the Civil War, because this was the battle that allowed Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation without having it sound like a cry of desperation. And as soon as the war became a war not just about restoring the Union, but also a war about ending slavery and freeing African Americans, it changed the entire moral character of the war and made it impossible politically for England and France to recognize the Confederacy. The Confederacy would have to win a military victory on their own. Okay, suppose this doesn't happen. Suppose Lee gets up into Pennsylvania and fights McClellan on his terms rather than McClellan's. Given the relative qualities and aggressiveness of the two generals, it's a pretty fair bet that Lee would have won. At this time, in late summer 1862, England was already trembling on the brink of recognizing the Confederate States. If they and France had done so in the wake of a Confederate victory, they could have imposed mediation on us the way we imposed mediation on Serbia over Kosovo, by blasting the shit out of our, pardon my French, out of our harbors and the like. We were, the technical term for what we were in the eyes of England and France is wogs. So imagine a world then where the Confederacy gains its independence at the end of 1862. Now push this world 20 years on to 1881. Take a look at what's going on there. The Confederate States would still be independent. The Confederate States would still need to lean on England and France because despite independence, the Confederacy is smaller and less economically strong than the United States. All right, suppose there is trouble, the United States want revenge, whatever, and suppose in 1881, the United States touches off another skirmish with the Confederacy, and suppose they get whipped again by the Confederacy and England and France. Basically, then we have a very distressing situation. The United States have now got whooped twice. The Confederates are hooked into the European alliance system. The United States, up until this time, I postulate, have held clear of entangling alliances, as George Washington advocated, even though he was a Virginian. And the United States have done so. But, you get whipped twice, eventually you stop listening even to people like George. If your enemies in the 1880s are allied with England and France, there is a certain obvious candidate for you to align yourself with. Kaiser's Germany, Bismarck's Germany. And I postulate, this is the kind of extrapolation process, that I do. So when World War I rolls around in 1914, it will roll around on both sides of the Atlantic rather than merely one. It will be rougher on the Entente powers because they will not have nearly the economic power of the United States pushing them on. Of course, the Confederates will have problems of their own. I'm fairly sure, in fact, that they will have emancipated their black population. I'm just as sure that they will not treat them as first-class citizens in this time. I mean, even after losing the real Civil War, they weren't treated as first-class citizens for another 100 years. Now, the other thing, I remember I was talking about Lincoln in Chicago in 1881. When Lincoln was, and before Lincoln was president, he wrote some very sharp things about the relationship between capital and slave labor. If he had lived, another 16 years after his assassination, he would have seen the rise of real laissez-faire capitalism in all its ugliness in the United States and also in the Confederate States. It's very interesting to, think about what Lincoln would have thought of the relationship between capital and wage slave labor. It's also very interesting to wonder whether, in some time between 1865 and 1881, he would have read the Communist Manifesto and other works of Marx and the guys who played all the Engels. So I postulate Lincoln as a socialist in this world, and basically as the socialists replacing the Republicans as the main opposition party in the same way that Labour replaced the Liberals as the main opposition party in England. But the other thing that's interesting to speculate about is what the writings of Marx and Engels would have done in the Confederate States. What sort of oppressed proletariat is there in the Confederate States? And what sort of people will view themselves as an oppressed proletariat? What sort of people will try to pull the same sort of thing that the Irish pulled on the British in 1916, except on a much larger scale because they're a much larger fragment of the population. So, these are the kinds of things that I look at. And, all right, in this universe, I imagine, the Confederate States losing the war in much the same way, getting ground down that Germany did in the real world in 1918. And there was, in my series of novels, a bad-tempered artillery sergeant named Jake Featherston, who discovered himself to me as the Fuhrer of this timeline, drunk under a bus bench in Richmond on leave in 1916. So, I take this all the way up to the end of a very different-looking Second World War. But these are the kinds of extrapolations that I make. You get your ideas where you find them. Adam mentioned Guns of the South. This is the book over there on the table that has Robert E. Lee holding the AK-47 on the cover, which is cool because that was my idea and they actually listened to me for a change. And this does not happen every day, believe me. Guns of the South was not a book I ever intended to write. Guns of the South was an accident. Back in the late 80s, I was and still am friends with a fine fantasy writer named Judith Tarr, and we would write back and forth because neither one of us had email yet. And, Judy was doing one of the things that writers habitually do when they talk with other writers. Judy was complaining about the cover art for an upcoming book. Judy said, "This is as anachronistic as Robert E. Lee with an Uzi, for Christ's sake." And I looked at that, and I thought, that's a good line, Judy. So I wrote back to her, and I printed out my letter, and I added this hand-scrawl P.S. on the bottom of the letter. Who'd want to give Robert E. Lee an Uzi? Time-traveling South Africans, maybe? If I write it, I'll give you an acknowledgement. So I looked at that, and I thought, I can do something with that. And I had, as I say, this was a hand-scrawled P.S. on the bottom of the letter after I signed it. And I Xeroxed it to make sure I wouldn't lose the idea. And I spent a year and a half researching and another year writing, and that was Guns of the South, and that was the book that let me quit my day job and tell lies for a living full-time. So I owe Judy a heck of a lot. Ideas are just random. All right, now, they said that I was supposed to talk about alternate history, past, present, and future. And since the future hasn't happened yet, this gets complicated. But if I leave you with anything, besides the impulse to storm Amazon.com and buy all my books. I mean, as I say, if I leave you with anything, I want to leave you with the notion that history is contingent as much as it is continuous. That pieces of it kind of happen at random and other pieces kind of happen because other stuff had happened before. We don't have a future ahead of us. We have a whole sheaf, an enormous sheaf of futures ahead of us, depending on which way we bounce off the pinball bumpers. Remember, we might have bounced some other way back in the past, and if we had, things would have looked quite a bit different from the way they are now. Thank you very much, folks. Thank you for coming out. I am told I am.
You're okay.
Am I good?
Yes.
Okay. I am told I am supposed to take questions, so I will take questions for a while. What can I do to you people? In the back, yes, sir.
So would you then say that steampunk and dieselpunk and the other punks are technically alternate histories?
They're related. They spring off the same impulse. I mean, the book that spawned the whole thing, The Difference Engine by Gibson and Sterling, that's definitely alternate history. How's that? Oh yeah, that works. Okay, that's better. Okay. Other stuff. Yes.
What was the most enjoyable book for you to write, I guess?
I haven't. Actually, it's not alternate history. It's a silly fantasy. It's called Every Inch a King. It's okay. This is another book I didn't intend to write, but my eldest daughter collects stamps. My eldest daughter is 6'1", left-handed, just got her doctorate in late antiquity. Doesn't take, relentlessly precise, doesn't take after me a bit, and she's a stamp collector, which is the same sort of thing that I do by being a baseball stat geek, so yeah, same impulse. And she gets Lynn's Stamp Weekly, and they were talking about the early postal history of Albania, which is a subject about which I knew slightly less than nothing until I saw this article. But it mentioned that there is one king of Albania who does not appear on any stamp, and there is a complicated reason for this. In 1912, Albania got forcibly severed from the rest of what remained of the Ottoman Empire in the First Balkan War. Greece and Serbia came up and down respectively and chomped off the land between. And the Albanians were mostly Muslim, unlike their Greek and Serbian neighbors. And they figured, all right, we've got to be independent or else they'll swallow us up altogether. And if we're going to be independent, we would like an Ottoman prince as our king. And they asked Constantinople to send a fellow named Halim ad-Din to become king of Albania. Getting word of this was a German circus acrobat, I'm not making this up, or I don't think I am, named Otto Witte, who A, happened to be a ringer for Halim ad-Din, and B, was fluent in Turkish, having served 2 hitches in the Ottoman army. And he got to Albania ahead of Halim ad-Din, along with his sword swallower buddy. And for 5 days, he was king of Albania. He disported himself in the harem they recruited for him. There are advantages to being a Muslim king. He declared war on Montenegro, just for the hell of it. He departed, when his story started to unravel finally, he departed 2 jumps ahead of whatever passed for the Albanian gendarmerie with much of the national treasure, which probably amounted to about $6.19, in his back pocket. And he dined out on this for the rest of his life. 20 years later, he wrote an autobiography, 5 Tage König von Albanien. which was published in an edition of possibly 9. I interlibrary loaned it so I could see, I read German slowly, but with a dictionary and patience, I read German. And, it had a picture tipped in of him 20 years later, 20 years older, with this enormous bushy gray mustache, had a belly bigger than mine, in this comic opera royal uniform. I mean, the edition was so small, the picture was signed, and I am absolutely convinced that in the copy I saw, that was a genuine signature and not just, not a photostat. Okay, 20 years after that, in the 1950s, Grace Kelly marries Prince Rainier of Monaco, right? Otto Witte tries to scrounge an invitation to the wedding on the grounds that he is a former crowned head of Europe. You cannot make this stuff up. You cannot make this stuff up. Next question. Sir.
What made you go into something like the Beyond the Gap? It's kind of
Okay. What made me do that was that I wondered what the world would look like after another couple of ice ages, and I thought I'd play with it and see what that's what it was. I mean, it's not alternate history. It's sort of on the uneasy borderland between fantasy and science fiction that Fred Saberhagen did so well.
What is your writing routine?
I write, I know how long I need. I've got a deadline February 28th, so I'm going to be a busy boy when I get home. So I'm about halfway. I'm about halfway through the book, but I'll get it done. I know where I'm going with it. This one's going quite nicely. I'm a primitive. I do, I am. I do first drafts in longhand. For someone of my vintage, when you composed on a keyboard back in the day, you composed on a typewriter keyboard. And some of you, like me, are sufficiently antique to recall that typewriters are not user-friendly devices. When you screw something up, if it's small, you slather whiteout over it and make it go away. If it's large, you go and retype the page. I did not like going and retyping the page. So what I started doing was, when I came to a spot where, wait a minute, I've got to think about this, I would write it in longhand till I had it the way I wanted, and then transcribe it so I didn't have any more than the usual number of my bad typing typos. And after a while I thought, this is trying to tell me something. And I started doing my first drafts in longhand, because for me, if I can type just about as fast as I can think, and all the crap comes out right there on the page or on the screen. But if I do it at a speed limited to what I can do handwriting, I'm much tighter. I use shorter words, I use fewer words. Much of the garbage never hits the page to begin with. And I mean, any writer has garbage. It's part of the process of, you have to get rid of the garbage to find the stuff that's hiding in the garbage that might look halfway decent, once you wash it off. And so I'm basically a two-draft writer. The first one is in longhand, which I clean up as best I can while I'm working on it, working as fast as I can while doing longhand. And then the second one is at the computer screen, where I do the rest of the cleanup and make it consistent and, fix all the stupid things that I still have left in the first draft. We have an uninvited guest with legs. Oh, rolling quarter, okay. I thought it was a bug. Sir.
So you read about editors and people acknowledge them and say thank you. So how much feedback do you actually get from an editor?
Editors, it varies from editor to editor, just as all writers do it differently. All editors do it differently. Some editors, if you have it in a reasonable way, they will leave it the way you wrote it. Some editors will say, okay, we'll be pickier. It depends on the editor, and it depends on the writer. Editors I have worked with say I give pretty clean copy, so and I'm pleased for that. The other adventure that the writer always dreads is when he gets the copy edited manuscript back. This is when they give it to a recent college graduate to improve, to fix up your bad grammar and your bad spelling and your, I mean, a good copy editor is worth his or her weight in gold because he will save you from all the stupid mistakes that got through your final draft, and there will be some. A bad copy editor makes marks on the page for the same reason that a dog will pee on your mailbox post, to mark territory. A really bad copy editor will drive you mad. My wife, used to, and you can tell very quickly when you're looking at the manuscript when it comes back marked up. My wife would ask me when I would get a copy edited manuscript when the kids were small, shall I hide the children? Because I have had some copy editors, I think, were largely responsible for the spread of AIDS because they would screw anything. I had a copy editor, quote, correct me in a language that I invented and get the grammar wrong. I asked never to have this copy editor work on my manuscript again. That didn't happen. That copy editor got another manuscript of mine to desecrate, and did not disappoint. This one was an alternate history rather than a fantasy, but it contained an evolved version of Latin that I had also invented, and was corrected incorrectly. This is the kind of copy editor where if you look in his left ear, you can look out his right ear. There are some like that, unfortunately. I've had a couple of others like that. I had one who happened to be, I found out by accident, the daughter of a writer much more famous than I will ever be, whom I will not name. And the really scary thing was on that one was that the editor I was working with took the gal's part. And I wrote some very rude things on the manuscript, I'm afraid, which is not professional. I lost it. I totally lost it. This was in the mid-90s. Back in those days, they didn't just email the file to a British publisher. They sent, the copy-edited manuscript, a Xerox of it with the author's, stets and stuff in it to the British publisher, for them to typeset. And I got a phone call from my British editor who said, in a much classier accent than I'm even going to attempt, who said that he sympathized with me and that, that the, again, quotation marks, corrections that I had, repaired were, quote, devastatingly illiterate. And that made me feel better anyway. So stuff happens, the joys of the writer's life and other fantasies. Other things. Yes?
Forgive me if you haven't already spelled this out in one of your books, but I haven't had the pleasure of reading it. I would like to hear more about Lincoln as a socialist.
That's in How Few Remain, and which is the first, you are warned, of 11, although it can stand alone. Lincoln, in the book, definitely has read Marx and thinks that he has some serious points, given the way that capitalism developed in the United and Confederate States after the War of Southern Independence. And, his wing of the Republican Party, he still has one. Obviously, he lost in 1864 because, he led the United States into a war and then proceeded to lose it, which is not a good thing to do if you want to get reelected. And he leads his wing of the Republican Party into the Socialist Party fold, and the party on the left and the party on the right, and what's left in the middle gets ground between them until it's a little third party, like the Liberals in the UK for so long. So that I obviously this is not subject to proof. I hope I made it plausible. That's what I hope for. And just speculating about what Lincoln might have done had he survived in these circumstances. I mean, that was the fun part, one of the real fun parts of the novel for me. Yes.
So what do you read?
I read an awful lot of nonfiction, and the reason for that, the one downside to being a professional fiction writer that I've found is that I don't read fiction the same way I used to when I was just reading it for fun. I am much harder to satisfy, and I am much more analytical than I used to be. I think, oh, that's a nice bit of characterization, or I think, oh, that's clumsy, or I think, no, wait, you telegraphed that. I know what's going to happen next, 30 pages on, and I just, there are not a whole lot of writers who don't create that effect, there still are a few into whose stories I can just fall, but there aren't many anymore. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, the other day I stumbled across, I can't even remember the title, but I think it was a fantasy, and the author was something like H. something Turtledove.
Oh, it's historical fiction.
And that's
that is me,
okay,
yes. I am H.N. Turtletaub. Turtletaub was the family name before my grandfather anglicized it. It's Yiddish. I did that for marketing reasons, because the historical fiction does not sell as well as the SF does. And chain store computers, this was back in the days when there still were chain stores rather than Amazon.com and everybody else, were not excessively bright. If your first book was Great Sex on Cable TV and it sold 20 million copies, they would order 20 million copies of your next book, even if your next book was translating Etruscan for fun and profit. And then if you wrote more great sex on satellite TV for your third book, because say your first book sold 20 million copies, right? But your second book sells 20 copies, no million. Your third book is more great sex on satellite TV, but it's got your name on it. Your last book sold 20 copies. We'll order 20 copies. So that's why I was Turtletaub. I think I've just turned into a pumpkin. Yes?
What inspired Rule Britannia?
Rule Britannia is a book set in 1598 in a world where the Spanish Armada succeeded. It is most of the dialogue is Elizabethan. Much of it is cribbed, stolen from Shakespeare. It's set. The English are attempting to rebel against their Spanish overlords, and Shakespeare is recruited to write a play that will help touch off the revolt. At the same time, he is also recruited to write a play for the Spaniards celebrating the life of King Philip, who was busy dying in Madrid. And which one gets put on and how and why is the story. Well, I got the idea a long time ago, and I sort of thought, well, okay, what do I do for the play that Shakespeare's supposed to write? Because as any number of people will tell you, I am not Shakespeare. Some of them will tell it to you quite vehemently, as a matter of fact. But, when in doubt, cheat. There is a play about the British Celtic queen, Boadicea, that was written by Shakespeare's younger contemporary and probable collaborator, John Fletcher. I stole big chunks of it and cobbled it together for my own purposes because, here's Elizabeth in the Tower of London fighting the Romans. Here's another play about a British woman, fighting the Spaniards. Here's a play about, another British female ruler fighting the Romans. The parallels are obvious. And when I found this play, I realized, oh, good, I don't have to write the damn thing. I can steal it. He's been dead 300 years. He won't even sue me. So that's what let me write it. And it was enormously challenging. And somebody asked me, can you write Elizabethan English, even faux Elizabethan English, without punning? And I looked at him and I said, no, but then I can very rarely write anything without punning, as some of you are unfortunate enough or pun-fortunate enough to know. So yeah, that's how that happened.
I have a few questions.
We all do.
I wanted to know, how do you feel about the butterfly theory in alternate history?
Oh, I don't try to particularly rationalize it. I have no idea if it's real. I have no idea if the other universes exist. I don't care. I can tell interesting stories about them, whether they're really there or not. It doesn't matter for my purposes.
Have you ever been on the alternatehistory.com forum?
No, I don't hang out there. Life is too short.
What is your favorite premise for a timeline?
The one I'm working on?
Okay.
I don't have any enormous, profound answers to that. I've done all kinds of weird things, and I've done, stories, as grim as they come, and stories where Babe Ruth ended up a bartender in Baltimore rather than the greatest baseball player of all time. And it's just whatever I'm working on. If it's not interesting, I don't do it.
Do you plan on continuing any of your older stories?
At this moment, no, but I rarely say never. I will say I will be very surprised if I ever do anything in the same universe as Guns of the South, but that's about the most I'll say.
So you talked about, at least the Guns of the South, doing a year and a half of research?
Yeah.
How much research do you actually do? How much do you feel like you have to have the history right? You are going to change things. You better not change them unintentionally, which means you better, know it. The more you know, the more you can goof with. And the other thing is that most of the research doesn't show, because if it does show, then you're lecturing, you're not telling a story. But the research is there. Okay, I had a character who was a Panzer commander in the Second World War. This is in the World War series where the aliens invaded in 1942. I read several German Panzer officers' memoirs, and in one of these, he mentioned a particular German decoration. This thing was a large, gaudy medal that was in value between the Iron Cross First Class and the Knight's Cross. It was called the German Cross in Gold. And the nickname that it had among the troops, because it was large and gaudy, was Hitler's fried egg. And I used this in such a way that my character brought out this sardonic line, in a way that illuminated what kind of person he was, and and how he felt, not totally impressed with the regime he was serving, So and that is the only thing from that book that I use. But when I use that book, whenever I see that book sitting on my shelf, I think, okay, that one paid for itself. Really, research is, for this kind of stuff is like a shotgun shell. And if one pellet wings something, you're golden. You do a lot more than ever shows up in the book. No, you were next. I saw it.
Thank
Yeah.
you. So do you write with an outline in mind of where you're going, or
I am usually very much a seat of the pants writer, because part of the fun is telling myself the story. This is I have the kind of borderline Asperger's mind that carries a whole lot of facts around and doesn't lose too many of them. So I usually manage to keep things straight. There are times when this gets scary. I did 4 books of that World War series. And 2/3 of the way through the 4th one, I had no idea, no idea, how I was going to wrap things up. I really didn't want to call my editor and say, Steve, I'm sorry, but this just blew up in my face. I really didn't want to do that. Fortunately, I managed, I think, to make it work. Yes?
Well, I presume he plays the outfield most of the time, through the 20s, because he was already doing it pretty much in 1919. He sets a lot of records. Whether he becomes as big a thing as he did for real, who knows? My assumption was different. My break point was earlier, and it resulted. Okay, for those of you who are not baseball geeks, will tune this out because it won't mean squat to you, I promise. What happened in the alternate world was that Milwaukee got the last Federal League franchise and Baltimore didn't, so that Babe Ruth was stuck with the International League Baltimore Orioles, and they didn't have to sell him if they didn't want to. I mean, Jack Dunn sold his players when the Federal League came to town because he was running out of money, competing with them at the gate. If they aren't there, he's still solvent. He keeps Ruth. Ruth can't do anything while the Federal League exists. He can't even jump. He's legally a minor. Jack Dunn is his guardian until the Federal League is dead. So he stays a minor league star with Lefty Grove and Max Bishop, and he finally makes the majors in the mid-20s, as an aging, sore-armed pitcher, who plays the outfield or first base every once in a while. Has a cup of coffee in the majors and goes back to Baltimore and tends bar like his dad did. There's a photograph of Ruth tending bar with his father after the Red Sox won. I forget whether it was the 15 or the 16 series because they won both of them. And God, he's a ringer for his old man. It's scary. All right, the rest of you can come back now. Yes.
Well, I haven't read any of your books yet, but I'm very intrigued. And I'm thinking, as you were a history, your specialization was in history, have you thought about Battle of Hastings and had that turned differently? Does that appear in one of your books?
That's not mine. I didn't do the Western medieval stuff. My wife did. So I don't know enough, and I don't really feel like working that one up. Yes?
Do you have any advice for me as an aspiring science fiction author?
Write. Keep writing. No, I'm serious. Learn your, it's the equivalent of saying to a guitar player, learn your licks. Keep writing, send it out, keep sending it out. Don't be discouraged when they tell you no. They will tell you no. Don't take it personally. The thing that I say to guys when they ask me about this is it's kind of like dating. If you ask a girl out and she tells you no, it doesn't mean that you're never going to ask another girl out again. It may not even mean that you're not going to ask that same girl out again under different circumstances. Stay with it. Don't give up too soon. Keep trying. Persistence counts in this business, maybe even more than talent, because persistence is what sharpens the talent. Sir.
I suppose, have you been approached by video game franchises to turn your intellectual property into games?
Yes, a couple of things. I have made some minor money out of this for options and for developments. Nothing has ever come to fruition, but yeah, I have been approached a few times. Sir.
Two questions. Number one, I assume you did read the Winston Churchill. How was it?
Oh, it's cool. I mean, Winston Churchill is one of the great prose masters of 20th century English. God, yeah, it's very cool. I mean, I don't know if that's the first double whammy, but it's sure one of the really early ones.
And my second one is J.J. Abrams just came to you and said you can have to pick of any of the books that you've written. Which one would you pick for the movie?
Oh, which one would I like? I would like Every Inch a King, because I think it would be hilarious. Or possibly the one book that I haven't mentioned yet, which is a fantasy with puns called The Case of the Toxic Spell Dump, which is another kind of accidental book. I was at the World Fantasy Convention in Tucson, Arizona in 1991, and My hotel was on Sesame Street, which cracked my kids up because they were little. And I was on a magic and technology panel. And one of the other people on the panel was a gal named Alexandra Honigsberg, who's a friend of mine. And Alexandra and I get along by sassing each other. We give each other grief. I mean, that's just what we do. You know, and Alexandra was saying that however you manipulate the environment, whether it's by engineering or by magic, there have to be consequences. And I made a smart-ass crack about toxic spell dumps. And I got a laugh. And I got enough of a laugh that I scrawled the phrase on my pocket program. Sitting in the front row of this panel were Paul and Karen Anderson. And Paul Anderson, of course, has written a magic as technology series of books called, in the Operation Chaos universe, and which is based on Robert Heinlein's Magic Incorporated. So I am standing on their shoulders and I am throwing pies. Because this book took off on me. It, it is a book where magic definitely works, where things with the same name as in this universe or with related names are not quite a spell checker is an entirely different critter, for example. Yeah, and it goes downhill from there. So, the only question when I got rolling with it was, can I stay silly for 120,000 words? And yes, I could. So that was great fun to do. Great and horrible fun. Other stuff. Thank you very much, folks.